Um, Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Hillel Fratkin of the Hudson Institute. I am the director of its Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World, and co-editor of its journal, Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, as well as our audience through live Ustream. And I want to mention at the outset that questions can be submitted by that audience via Twitter using the handle at Hudson Institute as one word. I said it's a pleasure to welcome you, and of course it is in the ordinary sense of the term, but the circumstances that bring us here today are anything but pleasant and really quite dreadful. And I hardly need to say that because the crisis in Syria has been going on for 18 months. It's in the papers every day. The body count is, with some disputes, delivered every day. So it's clear by now that something horrible is happening, has been happening in Syria. And the question we'll be addressing today is partially where things stand in Syria, and also what to do about it. In particular, we will have, as part of the discussion, the question of what are the international community's responsibilities and options, emphasis, I think, for some of our speakers on the responsibilities and the whole question of responsibility to protect. And let me mention here at the moment that, at this moment, that a document concerning that, a memorandum by the Warif Foundation, is available over here on the side if you want to pick it up as you go out. To discuss these questions, we have a very distinguished panel. I will mention them first of all, and then as they come up to speak, give a fuller introduction. Mara Bukai, who is a Syrian poet and political activist. Nasser Khadr, who is a Hudson Institute Fellow via Denmark. And Nasser Rabat, who is the Aga Khan Professor and the Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm going to ask my colleague, Nasser Khadr, to speak first. And first, let me say a little bit more about Nasser. As I said, he is an adjunct fellow here, and he is focusing on issues of freedom of speech and the fight for democracy and democratic values in multicultural societies. I think that would directly apply to the Syrian case, multicultural in particular. He was a member of the Danish Parliament for 10 years. He is the founder of Democratic Muslims, which was established in the beginning on the occasion of the Danish cartoon crisis. He is also founder and chairman of a Danish political party, the New Alliance. Nasser?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Let me start by saying that all the elements that enable the international community to act on responsibility to protect in Libya are also present in Syria and has been for a long time. The number of dead civilians in Syria has reached 25,000 and at least 50,000 disappeared. Sorry to say that, but Gaddafi only killed 3,000 Libyans. Syria is on the edge of civil war, and there is a high risk of ethnic cleansing and chaos in Syria and in the fragile neighboring countries. It should be obvious to everyone that Assad has failed in protecting his people, and that the killings will only increase in numbers and brutality if we do not act. Likewise, it should also be obvious that Assad has no future as Syria's leader. The main objective now is, first, not a regime change. First, the main objective is to protect the civilians, and second, a regime change. This bloody regime cannot continue. Then, why are we not helping the civilian population in Syria? An obvious obstacle is Russia, and some will add China. But China tends to switch sides and stick with the winner. We saw it in Libya. But the Russians not only vetoing different resolutions in the UN Security Council on Syria, they also provide weapons and money to the Assad regime. In the beginning of the uprising that was started by school children in the city of Dara, Assad was promising to reform the country, but he stopped talking about reforms since the Russian President Putin gave him his unconditional support. Since then, all talk about compromise and reforms have silenced, and Assad has turned all his brutality against his own people. Nevertheless, Russia is not the only one to blame in this situation. If there had been a demand for action in the United States and the Western democracies, a solution without Russia outside the UN Security Council probably would have been found at this point. I believe the explanation lies within our own Western domestic civilians. People in the West are simply fed up with war. They are more concerned with the financial crisis, housing, jobs, and so on. When I was a member of the Danish Parliament, I was taking part in the decision-making process regarding Libya. We were, Denmark, the second country after France who decided to send 8 F-16 flights to Libya to remove Gaddafi. And we removed him without soldiers on the ground, only by helping the Libyans by the airspace. I remember studies in Denmark of the public opinion showing that 80% of the Danish people supported an intervention in Libya. We feared genocide in Libya. When it comes to Syria today, only 1/3 of the Danish population supports an intervention in Syria. And I think that's the same in many of the other Western countries. Another reason for the lack of public support is that there is a fear that the Islamists will gain power. I'm not afraid that will happen in Syria, and I will elaborate this point later. Reasons not to intervene because Assad regime is military strong is nonsense and a poor excuse. We in the West have deliberately overstated Assad's strength, even though we know better. He's not that strong. It will not be difficult to get rid of him and his regime as it appears in the media. The Syrian military isn't as strong as we make it up to be in the West. If it was the Syrian military strong, Israel would not have been allowed to do whatever it wants in the Syrian airspace since 1973. Furthermore, Saddam Hussein was also said to have a strong military, but he was removed within a couple of days. People have also talked about the risk of Assad using chemical weapons. I don't believe he would do that. If he did, it would be a total suicide. Gaddafi said also that he would use chemical weapons, but he didn't. As long as the public demand is absent, we will not see our politicians take action. Take Obama, for instance. He is busy running his campaign and will only waste a minimum of time and money on a course that is extremely expensive but has little support. He will only change his opinion if the polls changes, as we saw it with the gay marriages. It's important to understress that intervention in Syria, no-fly zone, can't be done without the United States of America. I fear that the conflict will protract for a long time since the United Nations isn't prepared to act on the principle of R2P. The opposition hasn't got the weapons needed to beat Assad on their own. All the elements that were present for the international society to intervene in Libya on the basis of the responsibility to protect doctrine are equally present in Syria. In Libya, the international community acted in order to prevent a bloodbath and to protect the civilians from a brutal dictator. We should do the same in Syria. But we must ask ourselves, what will happen to Syria after Assad? It is difficult to predict anything at the current situation. The only thing we know for sure is that the longer the conflict in Syria is protracted, the more severe the consequence will be for the unity of the Syrian people and the safety of the religious minorities in the country. In the West, we fear that the Islamists will gain power in Syria. I see little chance of that happening. The Islamists are weak in this country. Syria is one of the most secular countries in the Middle East. The people had very bad experience with the Brotherhood in the 80s, where they were extremely brutal. The Western concern mainly derives from the recent events in Egypt, but these two situations aren't comparable. In Egypt, the Islamists have had a long tradition for running a welfare system where the government fails. They have erected schools, hospitals, and also supported the poor with money. In Syria, they have been banned, and the people therefore don't feel an obligation towards them. What the Syrians have instead is skepticism and bad experience with the Islamists. Nevertheless, we must be aware that many urgent issues have to be resolved before the Syrian opposition is ready to take control of the country, and to make sure that we leave little room for the Islamists to gain ground. For instance, there is no alternative substitute for Assad at the moment. The opposition is fragmented and needs to find common ground. Instead, they are fighting each other, which at the moment only send the country closer towards the edge of chaos. In Libya, the situation was different. The opposition was relatively homogeneous. They quickly took control of the next largest city, Benghazi, near the Egyptian border, where they got weapons. From Benghazi, the fight could be planned and structured. Furthermore, they got support from the airspace from NATO. And politically, the Libyan opposition, they got very quick top political figures from the inner circle of Gaddafi. His former Minister of Justice became president of the council. Therefore, they were better prepared when Gaddafi was removed. What on the opposite is the Syrian opposition consists of people without political experience, everybody wants to lead, but no one has the years of political experience needed. It is people that don't understand what it means to be pragmatic, compromising, and unifying. And one of the most essential issues will be for the Syrian opposition together, find a leader with political experience, and create a day-for-day roadmap for the country post-Assad. They will need to consider what shall happen, who shall lead, how will the prosecution take place, what shall the constitution contain, when shall the different elections be held, how do they take all the different groups into consideration, and so on. All are things that the Americans and the French have already asked the opposition to resolve, but to which they still are discussing. One of the most important things will be to agree on a reconciliation strategy like in South Africa. All hands will have gotten dirty on one way or the other. Therefore, it will be important to maintain most of the military like they did in Germany after Second World War II. Only the worst and most brutal should be prosecuted. The rest shall be kept. I hope the South African solution can be the example to follow. A few opposition figures are already saying that they will execute all Assad supporters when they gain control. This way will not lead to anything good. Therefore, the opposition must apply for a separation of powers. Then the country will be able to move towards democracy. It might not be a democracy similar to the Danish or American democracy or any Western countries for that matter. It takes very long time. Democracy as way of life is something that will not come overnight. People need to live in a community of law before they can become democratic to the bone. The important thing is that rule of law is established. All these issues are essential to take into consideration if Syria shall have a fair chance to preserve and protect the unique diversity this country have. Only in this country we find so many of histories, different religious groups still existing and coexist. If they don't succeed in preserving this, the world will become a poor place. And we risk that the Syria will fall into a civil war that will last for decades. The longer the conflict is protracted, the more likely is it that all of our concerns and fears will become reality. Hereby, I think ethnic cleansing, Islamists gaining momentum, and a general chaos that will affect nearby already fragile states in the neighborhood, like Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan. The outcome of this conflict, therefore, is far from solely about Syria. It will have a severe impact on the entire region. The reasons to act now are therefore much stronger than they were in Libya, simply because much more is at stake here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nasser. Our next speaker is Mara Bukai. Mara is a poet, and I trust there may be happier days when we can welcome her back for some tea and a poetry reading. But at the moment, she is a political activist involved with the Syrian revolution through political work with different factions of the Syrian opposition, and has also been writing and appearing on the media in connection with Syria. She's the founder and president of the Al-Waraf Institute, which aims to bridge the gap between East and West by emphasizing the importance of cultures as a platform for engagement, enhancing intercultural understanding, and encouraging dialogue between the citizens of the Middle East and North Africa and the United States. Mark.
don't know if it can be. Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, since peaceful Syrian protesters took the street in March 2011, chanting for freedom and dignity, the security forces of Bashar Assad have killed at least 26,283 people, among them 18,695 of innocent civilians. This number are the August statistics of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which has a network of activists on the ground across Syria. The numbers of martyrs in Syria continue to rise daily as people continue with their struggle for freedom. According to February 2012 United Nations report, Syrian government forces have repeatedly attacked civilians, launching artillery into densely populated neighborhoods, deploying snipers, helicopters, and airplane fighters against civilians, and torturing and killing hospitalized protesters. Despite the international community's effort to bring an end to violence in Syria, through peaceful measures like sanctions and peace plan, these actions have failed to stop the killing. Moreover, the Syrian government has flouted the United Nations and Arab League ceasefire agreement and attacked civilians in the presence of United Nations monitors. This action constitutes crimes against humanity as defined by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Only in Syria, it happened that every 15 minutes pass without action, another civilian loses his or her life by the regime atrocity. The international community does not have the luxury to lose more time in political battles while people are falling every day. Ending the killing in Syria is a moral and legal obligation that cannot be ignored. As the United Nations mission in Syria has come to a suspicion due escalation of violence, we call on the international community and the President of the United States to use the United Nations responsibility to protect mandate to end the state terrorism enforced by the Syrian regime. The responsibility to protect mandate, or the R2P doctrine of the United Nations, allows the organization to use all necessary measures as no-fly zones, peacekeeping operation, buffer our humanitarian zones to protect civilians and end systematic killing in a country when the state fails to protect the life of citizens. The Syrian regime campaign of destruction and killings of civilians has already claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Syrian defenseless people and committed an endless number of massacres. Today, Al-Warif Institute for Humanitarian Studies is releasing the R2P Doctrine Legal Memorandum prepared by the Public International Law and Policy Group. The memorandum evaluates the case for humanitarian intervention in Syria under the R2P Doctrine and applicable international law. Under R2P, state sovereignty is not absolute. State forfeits sovereignty when it fails to protect its citizens from genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Syria has breached its R2P duty by repeatedly attacking an armed civilian with indiscriminate force. Accordingly, the responsibility to protect Syria's civilian population now shifts to the international community. Under the R2P doctrine, a coalition of state or a regional organization could legitimately intervene in Syria with or without the authorization of Security Council. An intervention in Syria is perhaps the international community's best hope for preventing a greater humanitarian catastrophe. As such, humanitarian intervention in Syria would be consistent with international law and with the United Nations Charter. Ladies and gentlemen, Syria women and children are looking up to the world for assistance and protection. Therefore, we Syrian Americans call on Mr. President Barack Obama and all leaders of the free world to act immediately and decisively in order to protect and save lives of brave Syrians. However, the people of Syria made their decision. And for them, the only way is forward. They march with their heads held up high so they can live with their heads held up high. And as I'm an American Syrian, I'm looking to see my country of choice, the great United States of America, in full support of my country of birth, country of childhood and memories, my beloved Syria. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara.
Thank you very much.
Our next and final speaker is Nasser Rabat. Nasser is the Aga Khan Professor and the Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT. He is himself both an architect and a historian, and his scholarly interests include the history of Islamic architecture, art, culture, urban history, and post-colonial criticism. His most recent books are Mamluk History Through Architecture, Building Culture and Politics in Mamluk Egypt and Mamluk Syria. He has, however, been distracted by, if I may put it this way, by current events, and has written several articles on the Arab Spring. The Arab Revolution Takes Back Public Space, Circling the Square, Architecture and Revolution in Cairo, and Our Revolutions Between Freedom and Identity. Nasser earned his BA from the University of Damascus, his MA from UCLA, and his PhD from MIT. Nasser? Let me only add that I also want to extend an invitation to Nasser for happier times when he and I will maybe read from Alf Layla wa Layla and drink some more tea.
We'll drink to that. Good afternoon, everyone. We are gathered here to speak about Syria, so I would like to ask you all to stand for a moment of silence in memory of the martyrs for freedom in Syria and everywhere in the world. Thank you. Before it was forced into a military struggle, the Syrian revolution was, like its predecessors in Egypt and Tunisia, a nonviolent, spontaneous protest against 5 decades of brutal and suffocating dictatorship. The central chant of the protesters was Hurriya, Hurriya, or freedom in its most inclusive and indefinite sense. Today, that call has been dimmed by the regime's ruthless suppression and the rising militarized response to it. But it's not dead. It still has the capacity to reclaim the revolution and, in the process, restore its original clarity of purpose as a civil rights movement, albeit one that is expressing itself in an Islamic tone that is predictably disturbing even to sympathetic observers. But that need not be the case. For although some factions fighting today in Syria and receiving more than their fair share of media coverage and financial support are indeed professing extreme and alarming viewpoints about personal freedoms, civics, and rights of minorities, they are far from being the majority among the fighters in general and the Islamists among them in particular. Most Syrians, fighters or peaceful protesters, or even those still on the fence, Sunnis or from any of the other religious groups in Syria, would reject such fanatical rebels and would adhere to a moderate, and I would dare say, modern form of religiosity. That form has been mellowed and hybridized through more than 2 centuries of direct and sustained exchange with Western philosophy, humanities, politics, and more intensely, media and social media. My aim is not an attempt to minimize the problem of rising extremism. It is rather a plea to broaden the perspective on the issue, which may hopefully lead to a better commitment on the part of the Friends of Syria to help reassert the centrality of civil rights in the articulation of the revolution in my wounded and bleeding country. My take is rooted in the capacity of the Arabic language to calibrate meanings across a spectrum of cognate terms. But first, let me take you on a historical detour, that's my métier, that will illustrate the point I'm trying to formulate about the reciprocity and potentially the complementarity between a religious and a secular framing of the call for freedom. On the dawn of the modern era in Syria, a religious scholar and a fervent supporter of pan-Islamism from Aleppo, Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, 1849 to 1902, wrote a passionate tract, طبائع الاستبداد ومصارع الاستعباد, The Nature of Despotism, against the mounting tyrannic tyranny of the late Ottoman Empire. In his book, he presented an amalgam of ideas borrowed from the principles of the French Revolution and from Arabo-Islamic history, all clocked in a religious and legalistic language. His criticism was threatening enough to the authorities that he was exiled and perhaps poisoned by Ottoman agents for his audacity. He died in Egypt. But the power of his words endured. It actually manifested itself 80 years later in the most secular of milieus and in an episode that I heard from one of its protagonists. In 1980, at the height of Hafiz al-Assad's struggle against the military uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood, an order went out from the presidential palace to the editors of the government-controlled publications, which is basically all the publications in Syria, to publish special issues for the anniversary of the ruling party, which usually happens on the 7th of April, the Ba'ath. Zakaria Tamer, a leftist intellectual and Syria's premier short story writer, who is considered an Arab Gogol or an Arab Kafka, was the editor-in-chief of the scholarly journal Al-Ma'rifa, Knowledge, published by the Ministry of Culture. His solitary act of opposition was to publish copious excerpts from Al-Kawakibi's Tabai' al-Istibdad, in which the author denounced despotism and called for freedom, without any comment on the part of Tamir. When the new issue hits the censor's office, as is the routine, of course, in Syria, the chief censor, who happened to be Tamir's wife, called him and asked him to pack and leave to Beirut before she has to send the report about his infraction to the security overseers. He has been in exile since. Other anecdotes thicken this enmeshment between Islamists and non-Islamists in the forging of a local, representative, and expressive form of political expression that is anti-despotic and pro-democracy. New signs of that spirit are also appearing today. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood's Pact of March 2012 showed a commendable willingness to expand their understanding of civil rights and to encompass many of the rights that have been absent from their traditional literature. More work needs to be done, but this was definitely a step in the right direction. Similarly, a new coalition of young, progressive, and pro-revolution Syrian ulama, or religious scholars, called Rabitat Ulama al-Sham, the coalition of Shami or Syrian ulama, are exploring ways of reconciling modern and Islamic concepts of governance and modern political and moral values in particular, which have had a checkered history in the Arab political sphere. They too need assistance in the important task they have undertaken. By way of a gesture of cooperation from a secular to the religious people towards these efforts, let me conclude with a semantic and historical challenge before I leave you with a plan of action that consists of one recommendation. My challenge is addressed both to the Islamists and to the detractors of Islam, who insist on exclusiveness in Arabo-Islamic culture that is difficult to reconcile with the modern universal values, including the concept of civil rights, on the basis of divergent epistemological and semantic origins and trajectories. This binary opposition, like all binary oppositions, is ideologically inflated. At least in what concerns the key expression, al-huquq al-madaniyya, which is the Arabic term for civil rights, the actual semantic field of the term al-madaniyya, civil, allows for constructive and positive comparisons between religious and modern meaning. It is easy to observe that there is an actual parallel between the term madaniyya in Arabic and civil in the European languages, which of course was the reason behind the choice of the term madaniyya as a translation of civil in the first place. Both share the etymology of the city, civitas in Latin and Medina in Arabic, and civilization, civil, or madaniyya in Arabic, implying in both similar frames of reference, which have a lot to do with the link between building and managing cities and producing culture or civilization, including political culture, hence civil rights, in ancient Rome and in early Islamic Arabia. The link is, of course, not just linguistic, but historical as well. But that is a different discussion. I can actually speak about the Roman origin of civil rights in Arabia, but that's something totally different now. But the Arabic term, which, like all Arabic words, is based on a triliteral or triconsonantal root, madana, M-D-N, ma, mim, dal, nun, goes further in its semantic connections. The root is very much a cognate of the bilateral root, D-N, dal, nun, for the word deen, religion in Arabic, and the word dayan, judge in Arabic and in Hebrew as you remember, the Minister of Defense, and the word dain, or credit, or loan. Therefore, in one semantic field, we can find interlinked the concepts of city, civil, civilization, religion, law, and finance. A hopeful indication that we can work with all of them in tandem rather than in opposition in designing the appropriate and historically conciliatory Arab or Syrian civil rights. Linguistically, connecting the notion of civil rights to those of religion, law, and finance, and ultimately civilization, will allow a productive flow of significance between them and ultimately their mutual consolidation in a lived culture that uses and understands the language rather than their clashing. And what do we do with that insight? Here, I am cynically taking my cue from Asma al-Assad, the wife of Bashar al-Assad. In an infamous interview with the magazine Vogue, I'm sure many of you have seen it, published to her misfortune right before the revolt against her husband, Mrs. al-Assad maintained that her household is run on democratic principles. Quotation, "We all vote on what we want and where," she says. In her house, a grid is drawn on a blackboard with ticks for every member of the family. "We were having trouble with politeness," she said, "so we made a chart. Ticks for when they spoke as they should, and a cross if they did not." She continues, "There's a cross next to her name on that chart. I shouted," she confessed. "I can't talk about empowering young people, encouraging them to be creative and take responsibility if I'm not like that with my children," she concluded. I will skip the irony oozing out of this whole episode, and I will stick with the value of teaching democracy at home. Creatively teaching about civic rights and obligations using an approach that resonates with the more common religious language and continuing this education throughout all academic level may be the most promising path to a healthy formation of citizenship, as President Obama said yesterday, in the future Syria. He didn't speak about Syria. This is what this wonderful short book, which I will make available to all to look at, Dalil al-Muwatana, The Guide to Citizenship, by two Syrians, an artist, Ahmed Mualla, and a critic, Hassan Abbas, attempted to initiate in a short-lived Damascus Spring during the first year of Bashar al-Assad's rule. This book was published in 2005. Using both a simplified language and art, whereby every concept is illustrated by a small clay composition, these two pioneers managed to bring every single article of civil rights as promulgated by the United Nations closer to the minds and hearts of their Arabic readers. Granted, a similar effort today will have a double task of interpretation, from abstract to concrete, and from purely secular to religious language compliant. But the aspiration is worth the effort. And we, scholars and policy planners, have the responsibility to carry on with this process of rapprochement so that a robust form of civil rights adopted to the language understood by all Syrians will, I hope, emerge out of this long, bloody, painful, and fearfully uncertain, but ultimately liberating revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser. I want to make a couple of comments, but primarily ask some questions that have been inspired by your remarks. And I think I'll begin with Professor Rabat. To begin with, I don't know at this moment whether I should wish that the Asma's children are well behaved or not. If they're giving her trouble, maybe one should be grateful for that. And what you propose, if I may put it this way, is a kind of answer to the concerns people might have about what kind of civic culture will be available after after what? Whatever happens.
The day after, as they're calling it now.
And I guess of course the more immediate questions are how one would actually get to the day after. Although, as was implied by what you propose, and also, it seems to me, also your remarks about the various groups and everyone's remarks about groups, the Islamists or non-Islamists and so forth. The question is, how will those people behave, and what might guide their behavior? And each of you, in a way, has offered some guidance on that score. You've also raised the question of whether the problem of dealing with this is properly posed. Especially, Nasser Khader mentioned all the various obstacles that have been thrown up, or also, rather, all the different things that have been, objections that have been raised, and what stands in the way. Russia, to some degree, China, the difficulties that the West has in composing itself. The one obstacle you didn't mention, but I think is relevant for reasons I'll come to, is Iran, which has taken an extremely active role on Assad's side, and that role seems to be actually getting bigger. So in any calculation regarding what others might do, they necessarily take into account that there's someone, not only Russia standing on the other side, but Iran. Those are all what one might call direct political obstacles. The other obstacle that keeps surfacing, into which all your remarks have been addressed, is the fear of what happens the day after. And I would say that it is perhaps the case that too much stress has been placed on the Islamist problem, because it seems to me that even before one would get to that, one would face a somewhat different one, which is that if and when Assad falls, if and when the regime falls, there will be hundreds and perhaps thousands of militias on the ground. There are already probably that number, ranging in size from 20 lads in a village to much larger groupings. And the situation that one faces, the Syria or Syrian citizens will face, is how that is going to be composed. And I think that's at least part of what people actually don't know what to do or say about. And I would even think, to some degree, I think people are probably concerned about a radical, and certainly an Al-Qaeda-led Islamist future. But I think it's more there's to some degree pointed to because that's the most visible aspect of this in terms of the different fighting groups. So the question is how one can conceive of not a simply happy outcome, because that's inevitably not going to be the case. It's practically inconceivable that there won't be bloodshed afterwards, because there will be, as one Syrian told me, he had lost his fear of dying, and I asked him why. He said because he's too eager to have his revenge, and that's both very understandable, but also very an enormous prospect. But the question is how might that at least be minimized as an outcome? And here I want to just then come to the various and end with the various proposals, and especially the analogy to Libya. First of all, what one might do, that's a more technical question at this point, and I'd be happy to have your thoughts on that. If it were to come to an intervention. But the question is how one would get there. And Mara proposes the R2P and says that that does not require the sanction of the UN, or the Security Council at least. And perhaps that may well be true. The inclination to defer to the UN or to the Security Council, however, is part of really what the politics of the moment are. So the question is what case you can make in order to encourage people to say, we're not going to pay any attention to the Security Council. The second thing is, with regard to Libya, was Nasser Khader's observation that the public was for an intervention in Libya, but strangely enough is not for one in Syria, even though the number of casualties and murdered people is much smaller. It was much smaller in Libya than it is already in Syria. And even, one should observe about this now, the statistics now that were recited, approximately 25,000 dead. 5,000 of those people died in this month or last month in August. So the rate is accelerating, and at that rate, 60,000 people, an additional 60,000 people will be dead by the time we're back to next September. The thing is about if one looks at the Libyan situation, I wouldn't say that there was a huge clamoring, a public clamoring for an intervention. There were people who supported it. There wasn't a big public clamor in this country, and as you know, the administration was initially extremely reluctant to follow suit. What happened in that case was that the British and French said they were going to go ahead, and the Danish, and intervene. And that essentially dragged the United States in with the results that we know. The question in this circumstances, and just politically speaking, I'm not talking now about principles, Mara, is there someone willing to take the lead? Because that, it seems to me, is what it would take for an intervention. And one obvious possibility is Turkey. Yesterday, Foreign Minister Davutoglu was at the UN pleading the case and left in despair. The Turks they're the ones who are most clearly proposing a military intervention, buffer zones, a no-fly zone, and so forth. But they are unwilling, by their own account, to act without further support. So it seems to me that the question, if one's thinking about this seriously, about how there may come to be an intervention, it seems to me there's two things that have to be taken into consideration. One is, if the regime goes on killing people at the rate it does, that may finally tip things over, but that's at an extraordinarily high cost. Or is there someone somewhere with sufficient power to begin the intervention? Because I think it's fair to say once it begins, others will come along, not because they necessarily want to, but because they will have to. So that, I think, is the first problem. And then the second problem, but part of that is, I think, reassuring people that there is not a simply peaceful solution to the day after, but some kind of path that will mitigate the worst possible outcome, as we've seen in other places. Those are my, and that's a question, really. I mean, how would this come about, and particularly, how would one get to, just a happier situation at the end, where it seems to me that the kinds of things that Professor Rabat was talking about, and that you were talking about, Nazan, that you, Mara, would have an opportunity to work upon the Syrian society and the situation. Those are essentially thrown out, and I invite you all to comment on it, comment on them, or any of the remarks that you made, each of you made, and then we'll throw it open for further discussion.
Please, go ahead.
I'm the least political.
Okay, then go ahead.
Okay.
By the way, I was thinking, in the extreme case, maybe if Denmark started the intervention, people would feel obliged to.
No, I don't think that the Danish government are ready to intervene. We have got a new government, socialist government, that don't talk about Syria right now, and the support from the population are less than 30%. And I remember clearly that the week when we took this decision to intervene in Libya, it was about 80% that supported an intervention. And when you have a pool saying 80%, then you can, the politician will do everything to fulfill this. So I think, I don't think anybody would lead right now. I think this will go on for many months. I think first we will see somebody will lead when we see more pictures as we saw on Balkan in Bosnia, and if we see this kind of pictures every day in the news, then maybe the public opinion will change. I have noticed that the European news channels are showing a lot more about what's happening in Syria than in the United States. CNN International do it, but that's the international channel and not the US CNN. So we need to have much more pictures to change the opinion in United States. But maybe one day I think if the international community are going to do something in Syria, it will be outside the UN Security Council. I don't believe in 1 second that it will happen through the UN Security Council. I think one day we will see a coalition of willing between France, Turkey, some Arab countries like Qatar and Saudi. But I think it's very important that the United States is within this coalition, but it will not happen first after the election in November here. I don't believe that it will be happen before the election. But so I really can't see anybody leading right now, and that's why I'm afraid that this conflict will last for many months, maybe a year or more. I'm afraid of that. About the obstacles, I could have mentioned a lot of obstacles, Hezbollah, Iran, and so on. And it's right, Iran has a key role here. I can see it on Assad before Russia supported him 100%. He was the man who was unsure. He promised reforms and so on. It was another Assad than we see today. Now we see a very self-confident Assad that will not go on compromise in 1 minute or second. So about the Islamists, I have to repeat that Syria is different than Egypt. Syria is one of the most secular countries in the region, and the Brotherhood are not so popular as they are in Egypt. But the longer this conflict continue, the stronger the Islamists will be in Syria. Now we have the Nusra in Syria. I heard from an expert saying that Al-Qaeda has changed the name in Syria and are calling themselves Al-Nusra and not Al-Qaeda. They have a problem with their brand. It's difficult to attract young people to the name of Al-Qaeda. That's why they have changed the name. But they are coming from abroad, and that's a big problem. And that's why it's important to stop this conflict before the Islamists getting stronger in Syria.
Yes. I want. Thank you very much. I want to mention why we are lobbying for or launching the R2P doctrine this time. We're trying to bypass the vetoes that has been using frequently by Russia and, of course, China in the Security Council. There is a fact that this regime will not go without using force. I recall a statement made by the former defense minister of Syria. He was a close friend to Hafez Assad, the father. He made this statement for Der Spiegel, I believe, the prestigious magazine, German magazine, in 2007. He said precisely, quote, he said, we took power by the force of arm, and we're not giving up, but with the force of arm. It seems that the decision have been taken already, long time ago. And what we are seeing right now, what Bashar Assad doing in Syria, is just enforcing this strategy, the strategy of his father. and people who help him to build this country who became a country of fear and silence. We believe that R2P doctrine is the only exit right now. And I'm aware that there is no real and strong political willing anywhere. But we are keeping hope and keep pushing for this. The application of this doctrine, because what we really need right now, what's urgent for Syria, is to create a no-fly zone. The Syrian Free Army, they are doing their part. They are wonderful, but they need protection from the sky. They're doing their job quite, amazing on the ground, but without coverage from the sky, we're going to lose many of them, and we're losing already many of them every single day. I don't know who's going to take the lead, but what I'm sure about it, that we Syrians, we are not going to give up. We just launched it, and we're going to pursue it strongly.
I'm going to try to maintain my scholarly coolness and respond to some of the points that you made, Hillel, with actually very tentative propositions. I will reorder them the way you mentioned them, and I will first go back to the difference in treatment between Libya and Syria and try to sort of like look a little bit at why I think there is such a thing. Second is who will lead the intervention in Syria and who actually hasn't yet made their position very clear and who would probably provide some sort of a legal cover for such an intervention. And the third is an issue that is on the mind of a lot of us, and that is the notion of revenge in the day after. I want to go back to that point. It's very important. This is really very tentative, and please feel free to just tell me that you're wrong or you're just overstretching the point. I think there is a difference in the image between Assad and Gaddafi behind the reaction of the international community to the atrocities caused by one and the other. They're actually equally criminals, but one of them dresses well, speaks English well. Up until his meeting with Barbara Walters, he behaved fairly reasonably. That interview was the interview of a cuckoo, but that was fairly late in the game. Gaddafi was actually a buffoon for most of his career, and all of us have subscribed to that image. So the idea of going after Gaddafi is something that perhaps the media grabbed immediately. There is no doubt in my mind that the sacrifices of the Syrian people and the nobility of the Syrian revolution cause, at least in the first year, had not been met by the same kind of praise that the media had given to other Arab Springs revolutions. I should actually remind us all that the leader of the people who fought in Tripoli is a member of the Qaeda, and the American media had no problem with that, the Belhaj person. So to actually use this as the scarecrow to say we're not going to interfere is belied by the fact that in Libya we did interfere, we did allow the fighters on the ground to be the guy spent time in prison, in American prisons. And I will give you also another example of sort of like the fear of the fall of advanced weapons in the hands of the unsavory fundamentalist actors on the ground in Syria. The US is currently arming the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army is in the hand of a government that is pro-Iran. There is absolutely no guarantee that whatever weapons are being sent to Iraq are not going to be sent to Tehran, at least for testing, to check them out, to see what these things are. So if we are speaking about dangers I think actually the argument of danger in Syria is very weak, and we need to look for another reason. I'm offering the image. I'm offering the fact that we actually fall for secular images and for sort of like reasonably English speaking, reasonably thinking, reasonably presented individuals. The 3 kids of Bashar al-Assad happen to be blonde. This actually scores points in the West. Of course, actually, an English-speaking wife who's been on most American media, again, really scored points. Gaddafi, we have never met his wife. So, in a sense, there is a media battle that hasn't been waged and hasn't been waged correctly. And it needs to be done because, as I said, the nobility of the cause on the ground warrants much more sympathetic coverage than we're getting in Syria. So that's point number 1. The second is who might lead the intervention. Of course, all of us are looking up to the United States of America. The leader of the free world has done that before, has actually stood up to tyranny elsewhere, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, a bit late in Africa, in Rwanda in particular, actually, a black point in the record of President Clinton. And then ultimately in Libya, and I will skip Iraq here for obvious reasons. But Saudi Arabia and Qatar are supposed to be arming the opposition in Syria. Saudi Arabia controls the Islamic organization. There are 57 country members in there. In the invasion of Iraq, the first invasion of Iraq in 1999, 2000, under President Bush the father, he waited for a cover from the Arabs and the Islamic organizations to justify the attack. And actually, he managed to even co-opt Hafiz al-Assad and Hosni Mubarak to send divisions of their armies for that invasion. We have not worked on that front. This is a front that needs to be reminded of their obligations. They can't just play behind the scene. The Qataris sent a squadron of aircrafts to Libya. And now, I don't know what they're sending, perhaps money, perhaps grenade, but not really a big thing so far. One needs to ask these people to actually behave the way they are speaking. And I'll mention here the last newcomer, Mohammed Morsi of Egypt. The guy has been vocally anti-regime, but Egypt has not even committed. I mean, he kept on saying we're against intervention, that's fine. How about if you actually look for an alternative? How about if you say an Arab intervention, or at least an Arab peacekeeping force, or an Islamic peacekeeping force? Because I'm sure actually this will alleviate the pressure on the West, and they will immediately support it. So we need to think about that. The third point is the revenge, and that takes me to really the heart of what I was talking about, which is that in the day after, and I have been reading the document the day after, a 120-page document that was put out by a new NGO registered in Belgium, and most of the actors are actually Washington area residents, Syrian dissidents. And it is fine and dandy, but it does not address the context of Syria. And that's what I was actually trying to reach in my comments, about trying to enmesh the Islamic tendencies with the civil rights, freedom, secular views, and democratic views of the future of Syria. So in the issue of revenge, it would be very difficult for someone like me, who has absolutely no credentials in Syria, to stand there and say, do not commit crimes against people who have harmed you or harmed your family. They will have their day in court. But a sheikh of a mosque will be able to do that. There is a whole network. There's actually 12,000 religious scholars in Syria that are all employed by the state. I would say about 500 of them are pro-regime, and 100 of them are blatantly pro-regime, but I would say the rest are not. I'm always extremely suspicious of religious scholars, but they could play a major role in stabilizing the civil future in Syria. This is the class that we need to reach in order to educate them about the parallels, about the existing parallels between what they believe in and what we believe in, and that we can work together in order to actually reach some sort of a civil, democratic, less bloody, less revenge-oriented society. Otherwise, I'm afraid we will see a lot of Alawi villages wiped out.
just to confirm what Nasser said about the smiling dictator. We met him 2 years ago, the foreign committee of the Danish foreign committee. We had a meeting with Assad for 1.5 hours, and that was 6 months before the uprising, and that was the general impression of him. Oh, he's so westernized. He speaks English. He has a tie and beautiful wife and so on. So everybody got a good impression of Assad. But I would like to ask this question: If we switch Libya with Syria, if it started in Syria, would have been an intervention? So, even though we have a smiling dictator, I think so.
Sure.
Yeah, just want to say that the intervention in Syria is already in place. When the minister of Russia announced a non-ceasefire from Moscow, this is an intervention. When we see the Hezbollah military forces training Shabiha, who are the security forces in Syria, how to kill and committed massacre in Syria, this is intervention. And my fear that the only option now for the regime to export his crisis to the neighborhood. We have seen what's happened in Tripoli, in Syria. This is very dangerous, very dangerous. So we are talking here. We are not talking about unilateral intervention. We are talking about applying the responsibility to protect civilians, to create a non-fly zone. It's very important, no-fly zone, and what you call it, the secure buffer zone, where the opposition could gather, and the defected political and officer from the army could gather as well. So this is very important. And in another point, Al-Nusra, what you hear about Al-Nusra group, this has been made by the regime itself. They imported the jihadists and trained them in camps in Syria, in the north of Syria, and sent them out to Iraq to build a democratic country over there. And now it's time to bring them back to Syria to do the job in behalf of the regime. There is no Qaeda, there is no Salafist. I can assure you. I am in communication every single day with young, very educated, secular officer in the Free Syrian Army. They left behind them their family and their home and their job. Just they wanna, help Syrian people to get rid of this regime. Thank you.
Thanks all. I want to let me just clarify a couple of points that have emerged. First, I agree that Assad has had certain advantages, I'm really not certain that it would have, if the Syrian crisis had preceded the Libyan crisis, that it would have made any difference. Gaddafi was a man whom no one liked, and he had no friends. Assad was a person who got much better press and had friends, and still has them. Friends who are willing to put money and ammunition where their mouth is. I mean specifically here the Iranians, and other friends who are willing to block other people from competing face to face, head toe to toe. So those are very substantial differences. I also want to say that I agree that many of the arguments put forth for why an intervention is ill-advised or would be very hard are probably disingenuous. For example, the argument that Nasser Khader referred to concerning Syrian airspace. Yes, it's probably a little less daunting than people have made out. And and other kinds of things that have been offered up as reasons or excuses. That is to say, they proceed really from already a disinterest in or disinclination to intervene. But I think a lot of that has really to do, but it's still the case that people think it would be harder because precisely for the reasons that well, to begin with, that Assad has friends, and in making a decision to intervene and to go up against him, you're taking on his friends as well. And that is, I'm not saying that should be a decisive obstacle, but that's a different set of issues. And the other part is the question of just what would happen afterwards. And perhaps I was unclear. I certainly think that the issue of certainly Islamists or terrorists playing a prominent role down the road is a serious one. On the other hand, I think as people have observed, it gets more serious the longer you let things go. That's clearly happening now because, among other things, the jihadists somehow never want for money. And some of the militias are drawing closer to them simply because they've got money to pay for ammunition, and that's going to have an effect. The longer it goes on, that's the way it is. But those, I think, are the really the hard things. Namely, that are people going to go up against Iran, and what does that mean? And if one does and wins, what does that mean? We have time for questions. Please, please wait till the microphone reaches you, and then give us your name and affiliation, please. Right behind you. There's a woman behind you, right here.
Thank you. My name is Inji Said.
You have to hold it to your mouth. I'm sorry.
Okay. So is it clear like that? Oh, my name is Inji Said, and I actually had I have several questions. The first one again
Usually
is
we say one to a customer, but okay.
Oh, okay. So the most important one would return us back to the issue of Islamists, and so far the Syrian government have used the allegations, as we say, that the revolution now is led by Islamists or jihadists or Salafists who are trying to take power in Syria. And everyone else has been saying, no, there are no Islamists in Syria, and it's a revolution by the Syrian people, and life is nice, and there are no terrorist groups. But a few days ago, I read an article in the journal, in one of the Egyptian journals, saying that actually Syrian opposition is calling on Salafist groups in Egypt to go and support them, and that there has been found some Salafists from Egypt and Saudi and other Arab countries who went there to support the Syrian opposition. And I don't want to underestimate the danger of Islamists, and I don't want to say that everything the Syrian government is saying is not correct, because in Egypt, from our experience, the government always used to say that, oh, the revolution is led by the Muslim Brotherhoods, and if it's not Mubarak, then it's the Brotherhoods. And even though it was not the case, eventually who came to power were the Muslim Brotherhoods. So governments might actually know something that we do not know. Or the second thing that made me say that not everything the government is saying might not be wrong is that up till now there is a support for the government. And I don't think that everyone supporting the Assad regime is just the class that benefits from him, because if it was the class that's benefiting from him, then they would have been a minority, I guess. because the majority of population were marginalized regarding of their sect. So from where does the regime get the support, and why hasn't many defections happen within the regime that would enable the opposition to take power or to achieve more
Is that your question? Huh?
advancements? Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Someone want to?
No.
I want to actually start my answer to you with a question to you. Do you believe in democracy?
Democracy, the way that people define it.
I mean, do you believe in an electoral system that would allow people who gain the most votes to come to power? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Certain conditions.
Yeah.
Certain conditions have to be there, and I believe in democracy, but I believe that democracy is not for everyone.
But see, this is actually then will prevent me from answering your first question, because although I would never vote for an Islamicist, I would actually respect the votes for Islamicists in a country in which all indications in Egypt were that the Islamicists were brought to office through the electoral system. So if this is the case, and this is what we all are struggling for, basically a democracy that the Arab world hasn't had in 30 or 40 years, we have to respect the outcome. I mean, I, as a secularist, am the first person to admit that we have failed to create a large popular basis for the ideas of secularism. But the time is not late, because at least in Syria, actually, the Islamic tendencies in Syria are very moderate. They're actually, as I called them, they're very modern. So it is very plausible and possible that there will be an Islamic government in a future democratic Syria, but it will not be an Islamic government that will push for the kind of restrictive system that we are fearing. Now, no one is denying the existence of Islamic fighters, jihadists on the ground, but again, put things in perspective. To go back to your question about who supports the regime and who doesn't, this has been for a year a revolt of people on the ground without any fighting, a bit less than a year. And people were coming out in specific areas in the country that are the areas that were very much hit hard by the irresponsible economic policies of the regime in the last 10 years. And a regime that for 40 years claimed to be representing the poor actually got the poor to revolt against it. It was the poor Syrians that came out against the regime in the first more or less year. The rural areas, the small town people, and a lot of these people actually went out against the regime. The support of the regime is way exaggerated. I know everyone in the regime, so I'm speaking from within here. The regime does not depend on popular support. It depends on a mukhabarat system, a security system. So there is really no polling or no public opinion in Syria to say that 50% of the Syrian people support the regime. I think actually the numbers are exaggerated. I think that the regime does not need popular support to survive. It needs vital support of the vital elements that the regime has nurtured and cultivated for the last 50 years for the possibility of any challenge to its rule. So again, my answer to your two questions, the first one is that we need to respect the opinion of the majority. The second is that we should be wary of claim of majorities, because there's no such thing as a majority of Syrian supporting the regime today.
I didn't say
that's-
that it's a majority, though.
I think we have to.
Not even a minority.
Yes, this gentleman over here on the right. Just could you wait 1 second?
I'm Dino Drury, interested citizen. At the ends of World Wars I and II, great efforts were made in places where populations didn't get along for reasons of religion and language and so forth, to sort out those populations. And it was very, very successful, such that Europe has been, to a surprising extent, given its history, at peace since being sorted out at the end of World War II. Even in the former Yugoslavia, there has been some informal sorting out after that was all straightened out. I'm thinking of a soccer player here who's Serbian, but his family moved to Canada because they were from Croatia. What would be the prospect of sorting out that region? Because Syria is not the only place where you're having internecine warfare and bombings and so on and so forth. Such that, for example,
Well, why don't you,
the
Sam,
Alawites in Syria would be moved to Iraq, which is Shiite majority, and the Sunni minority in Iraq would be moved to Syria, and then it all sorted out just like they did with Germany and Poland.
No comment.
um, right, yeah, take this gentleman here and then the woman at the front.
Hi, my name is Jonas Klaas from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I've been working closely on the responsibility to protect for several years now, and I thank you all for your great presentations today. They were very insightful. Is this microphone on?
Yeah, it's on. It's on.
Okay, thank you. I have a very brief comment and a question. This presentation today is also timely because 2 days ago there was the annual General Assembly dialogue on the responsibility to protect that took place in New York. I think some of the statements made by Mr. Kader have been confirmed there, that most of the member states of the General Assembly agree that Security Council impasse is at the crux right now of coming to an implementation of R2P in Syria. But I think it's also important to look at some of the emerging powers. India and Brazil, for example, they expressed extreme caution in applying R2P in Syria, and that is mainly the result of the intervention in Libya. So I would be cautious in making the analogy between Libya and Syria, because it doesn't really strengthen the case for R2P in Syria within those important players outside Security Council, nevertheless, veto power. Also, I would like to make sure that we have a common understanding of the responsibility to protect. It's important to stick to the language. I don't want to sound too wonky, but it's important to stick to the 2005 language of the World Summit Outcome document. That's what has been agreed upon by the heads of state and government in the General Assembly. And that interpretation of R2P does not automatically allow for no-fly zones, buffer zones, etc. It does require Security Council resolution in order to take coercive measures. Non-coercive measures, they can be taken without resolution, but the coercive ones, important to phrase that, I think, do require a resolution. My question to you all is, in retrospect, you all monitoring the situation in Syria very closely, have there been missed opportunities for the international community, neighboring states, the UN, the US, prior to the uprising in Syria, in order to prevent these atrocities from happening? Have there been actions that could have been taken in advance to prevent these situations? Thank you.
Okay. Just, you want me to answer right now?
This is directed to all of you, so
Okay, just I want to answer the part of the R2P. First of all, the memo, the legal memo we have here, and please feel free to have a copy on that available. Okay, perfect. It was written and prepared by a pro bono legal, firm here, and the language, it's a legal language, right? Number one. Number two, for the point, what you just mentioned, of, applying the R2P with or without the Security Council. Of course, I can argue here that through the General Assembly, if you have
vote, if we voted, for the application of R2P, it could pass. And don't forget that we have the group of Friends of Syria. There are more than 120 countries. They're willing to vote for the application of this doctrine. So we are, counting on this country to help us. Of course, we said in the memo that it could be with or without the security.
This R2P, also called the Kofi Annan Doctrine, that says that protecting civilian is an international matter, not an internal matter. So to protecting civilian comes first before the border, and and I think it was after the experience from Rwanda and Darfur and so on. I think it's very beautiful doctrine, but and we use it in Libya, and we were going to use it even though we didn't got the UN resolution 1973. Sarkozy, he started bombing Libya before this resolution was in place. So the coalition of willing was going to intervene in Libya, even though Russia and China had vetoed 1973. So you can use R2P outside the UN Security Council, but it's right that it's a part of the doctrine that you have to get a resolution in the UN Security Council. You also asked about missing opportunities. I think one of the, one of the biggest mistakes the international society has done is also, they have done a lot, but especially telling Assad to intervene is out of question. That the same as giving him carte blanche. And that's what the chairman of NATO said. We will never do it. Don't tell a dictator that you will never intervene. Then he will do whatever he wants to do. So I think it's wrong that the international society, again and again, telling Assad regime we will to intervene is out of question.
If I understood you correctly, you were asking about possibilities or potential before the uprising, not after the uprising, and there is one glaring example where the international community failed to actually uncover the duplicity of the Assad regime, and that is the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri of Lebanon in 2005. There are huge suspicion that the decision was made all the way up in a presidential palace in Damascus. There's no proof, so I'm not actually making the accusation. But the Lebanese Cedar Revolution immediately after that ultimately forced the Syrian army to leave Lebanon, and the international tribunal that was put in place were let go, were actually allowed to sort of like die off. The international tribunal had two main inspectors, one after the other. They never actually came up with a clear indictment. They never even came up with a clear statement. There was a lot of fear for the stability of Lebanon, for fear of problems that Hezbollah would cause to Israel, and that kept the case somewhat sort of like dormant in Lebanon. And this would have been the opportunity for the international community to actually create an extremely uncomfortable environment for the Syrian regime to function in the world as a legitimate regime. Because you could have indicted, and there were 4 major officers, one of them died a month ago, on that indictment that was never revealed, but it was made somewhat public. All of us knew about it, but it was never actually made official. It could have been pushed, and it was not. So that was really a missed opportunity.
I would, to add to that point, it seems to me it's worth also bringing up something you yourself brought up, Professor, about, which was the extraordinary favorable and flattering press that was accorded to Assad all the years running up to this. And I think of that because it's obviously made things harder now, but it also encouraged him in the notion of his security. And in this connection, it's worth observing where the uprising started. It's at least possible that Syria altogether could have escaped the Arab Spring, it seems to me. But the thugs who worked for him couldn't tolerate a few young boys in Dara scribbling some graffiti on a wall. I mean, that's where the whole business started. They arrested them and tortured them. I don't remember if they killed them or not, but
no.
And you know, why do that? Well, you know, if you as the expression says, if you can, you do, and if you think you can, you do. And I think that was the very great self-confidence that the regime gained over all that time, and so forth. The other thing I want to say is, I don't want to enter particularly into the specifics of the legalities of R2P, but I think it is worth observing that R2P, as someone just said, was emerged out of the great failures of the international community to deal with Rwanda, to deal with Bosnia, Darfur, and so forth. And one consideration that the international bodies that have embraced this have to, I think, consider is that if it is shown to be completely ineffective in this situation and doesn't have any bearing, then I think that whole regimen basically just goes up in smoke, because and it will show that there is really no kind of serious international response to this kind of thing. There's not an international response. There may be individual countries or groups of countries that feel they have to do something, and can do something. In the case of Rwanda, if the Belgians and the French had acted with the support of the Americans, something could have been done. But there was then, as now, a sense that everything has to be done with everyone's agreement, and that's not likely to occur. So there has to be, this is going to be a real test. Unfortunately, it's the Syrians who are are proving to be the guinea pigs here. But if it's invoked and doesn't lead to anything, I think people will just forget about it. Just right here. I'm roughly going from back to front, and I'm afraid I probably won't get all of your questions, but I probably can't promise them, but I can't commit them, but perhaps our panelists will stay a little bit longer to answer questions. Yes.
My name is Marina Barakat. I'm with the Public International Law and Policy Group, and my question is about the organization of the opposition. I know you were speaking about the differences between opposition in Libya and in Syria and how that really makes a difference. And I think that the international community would be a lot more apt to act if there was a central figure or a central force for everyone to rally behind. So my question is, on a purely practical standpoint, is there anything that can be done by the opposition in Syria now to bring them together and kind of move that intervention along, or is it just a waiting game now to see if and when countries will finally intervene?
The opposition, the Syrian opposition, unfortunately, it's all over the place. It's not easy that we gather in, we are all over the world and we don't know each other. We form as you know, the SNC, the Syrian National Council, and we are trying very hard to reform the Syrian National Council, and we have the next meeting for reconstruction the council on by the end of the month, by the end of September. I believe the opposition inside Syria, they're doing much better than us, despite all what they are going through. And we are in communication with them, and we are counting on them to get together, because they can do it better than we can here. As you know, I don't like to say outsider and insider, but this is the case, because we live. I mean, we cannot go to Syria right now, and this is the reason we are pushing to have this buffer zone or secure zone where we can gather all together, opposition from inside and outside. And myself, I'm going to Turkey, and we're trying to enter Syria from the north. There is a secure right now area when we can enter Syria, and we are going to meet opposition over there on the ground.
Right here in the center on the left.
Thank you. My name is Christy Delafield. I'm here with the Syrian Expatriates Organization.
Can you?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No.
My name is Christy Delafield. I'm here with the Syrian Expatriates Organization. We work with the opposition as well. My question is actually just specifically on next steps for R2P. I mean, you mentioned the Friends of Syria, of course, the UN General Assembly meeting coming up. Are you also planning to take this before NATO, before the Arab League? Dr. Rabat discussed the possibility of Islamic peacekeepers. What do you see as the next steps for promoting this principle and moving it forward?
Because I've been working on that in 6 months, I can answer very briefly your question. We already submitted the R2P to the Arab League in our meeting in Cairo. We submitted it twice to the former president of General Assembly, Mr. Al-Thani, I believe, and we submitted to the new one, the new elected president of General Assembly. We had scheduled a meeting with him. Unfortunately, the head of SNC couldn't make it to the United States, so we canceled the meeting and we submitted by mail. And we submitted as well in a private meeting with, the State Department. And today we have a meeting as well with the Syrian desk, and we are going to submit it for a second time for the State Department. And we are trying to move forward slowly but surely.
This gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this invite.
Can you?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I am a Syrian American and Muslim Sunni. I feel it's very important to clarify a couple comments to the audience, because it seems like the audience is mostly American audience. So I appreciate very much your presence as well as your interest in our story. Mr. Brody, the Syrian conflict is not a religious conflict. It's not between Sunni and Alawite. It is between the regime and the people. Me and Dr. Nasser Rabat were close friends in high school. We had Jewish friend, we had Christian friend. We didn't even know they're Jewish and Christians. I do not want Syria without Alawite. I do not want Syria without Druze. I do not want Syria without Christian. It is like you're saying the United States, without the Catholic. It is the great United States because it is the melting pot, and it is the great Syria because it has all these different groups and religions, and it is so rich in history. So believe me, do not believe the media, do not believe anybody who tells you it is a religious war. It is not a religious war. It is a war between the right and the wrong. For the lady in the back who said democracy with condition, that's her personal opinion, and I appreciate that and respect that, but that's not Islam. Islam is about democracy, period. It is said, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ. did not say أمرهم شورى بينهم means the subject discussed among the people, it is up for discussion without conditions. So therefore, Islam has a real democracy without conditions. I just wanted to clarify those two comments. Thank you.
Some over there on the right. You're on your right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you again for coming. Eli McCarthy with Georgetown University. I guess I'm struck by this pattern where in the Syrian revolution there was sort of nonviolence was tried for a month or so, and then it was decided that they didn't want any more, or not they, but the international community primarily decided they didn't want any more. And then violence becomes the primary option for 15 months or so, and we're still asking for more. You mentioned the South Africa model, one of the commenters, and I thought that was a really interesting case because one of the things that they learned was they ended up going with violence for 25, 30 years, and then in the 80s shifted back to nonviolence, and that was when they got a lot of support and apartheid ended up falling. So just in that context, I'm wondering what you think about some suggestions that have been made. One is the ICC, International Criminal Court, making a public investigation to all forms of violence or atrocities on both sides. And two, taking up restorative justice measures, not like a big Truth and Reconciliation Commission at this stage, obviously, but more small-scale kind of measures that would try to address the wounds that have obviously occurred in many people in various ways and how to heal those wounds. And one of the things that
I think that's already quite a number of questions for them to respond to. So why don't you leave it at that?
Sure.
You want to?
I just want a clarification from you, Eli. Where did you get your numbers about 1 month of non-violence and 15 months of violence? When do you date the beginning of violence on the part of the protesters?
I think it was somewhere around April or May of last year. You said it was about an 18-month revolution, the first month or so. I mean, maybe it's a little bit longer, but it's around that proportion of a very short time for nonviolence and then lots of months of violence. That's the point.
Well, the Free Syrian Army was established 8 months after the beginning of the revolution, and there was no claim of any fight before that on the part of the protesters. The government was actually sending plainclothes mukhabarat individuals to shoot at the protesters and claim that these are the people that the government was shooting at. There was this famous clip that came out of Dar'a where there were 4 individuals that were actually in front of the city hall or at an official building, and they were shooting at the protesters, and the government presented them as terrorists. The building was heavily guarded. These people couldn't have stood there with their guns shooting at the protesters without the guards of the official building behind them stopping them. So I would tell you that up until October there was not a serious resistance in terms of using arms. So although I sympathize with your question, but I think actually that phrasing it or framing it with diminishing the peaceful beginning of the protest will give equal weight to the violence of both sides later. Whereas you have to acknowledge, as you start questioning the violence of both sides later, that one side came to violence forcibly, did not start with the notion of violence. It was the government that responded with violence at the beginning. And to me, it's very important to establish that ethical inequality before we address the actual issue of how to handle the escalating violence now, which I will agree with you, it's now caused by both sides. But we should always maintain in mind that we are dealing with a moral issue in which a government had lost all legitimacy by shooting at its own protesting people for the first 8 months of their protests until the people started shooting back. To me, that's very important.
Yeah, I think when I'd like to confirm Nasser's remark. I mean, and when, there's a kind of simple proof of it actually. If you look back at the early part of the Syrian protests, you'll find every Friday there were actually huge crowds coming out of mosques, and one of the odd, I hate to use the word irony in this context, but one of the odd consequences of it was people at that time, in the spring of 2011, were so impressed, and I say outside Syria, were so impressed by the degree to which people would peacefully submit themselves to violence on the part of the regime, that they thought at the time this would necessarily be successful. If people had the willingness to sort of march in the streets out from the mosques, be beaten down or shot down and so forth, that the regime would have to break. And I think if you look back at the press at the time, you'll find that that's the sort of standard commentary.
Can I just add actually one thing?
The main, I just want to come back to your point about October. October was a critical turning point, and you can see this from the Iranian press on almost a daily basis when it talks, because it talks a great deal about the Syrian crisis, and you'll see that they have a standard formula that says there were disturbances, there was a reform process that was initiated. It was all resolving the situation until October. They always use October, and they always say October was when the U.S. or the Saudis or whoever began to rev it up again in the form of terrorism. And so they clearly know that that was the break point for this.
Beside the arithmetic point that I was making, Ella Clinton, the other point is that up until Christmas of 2011, the regime was regularly organizing huge rallies of support. Not a single person was shot dead in any of these rallies. So if the terrorists were there fighting against the regime, they would have actually shot at its supporters, rather than basically the first 1,500 people killed in Syria being basically protesters against the regime that were killed by the regime.
Yes,
I actually rest my case there. I mean, just in terms of who is killing whom, it's very important to have the sequence right.
I'm afraid we only have time for a couple of more questions, you and you, but if you'll make them very quick, okay?
Okay. Well, my question is definitely short. My name is Max Wilson. I'm a recently returned Peace Corps volunteer who served in Morocco and just returned several months ago. And my question has to do, this might be a little bit more on the logistics side of things, but say we do the education about revenge and preventing the revenge attacks that we all fear. Say there is an international coalition that comes around. What happens if that international coalition comes around with responsibility to protect, UN resolution or not, and there is no on-the-ground opposition leader or politically trained people ready to take over the role of the government? What happens in that void immediately after the overthrow?
There is a non-profit organization right now on the border in Antakya, and they are training leaders coming from inside Syria, training them as a spokesperson, as military leaders. They are training them, and they're doing quite well.
Anecdotally, let me just say that, I mean, there are plenty of Syrians who are probably very good at playing the political game. I have someone next to me on my right hand who did it in Denmark. There's no reason for him not to be able to come back to Syria and play it.
Okay, Ines?
Hello, my name is Elif. I'm a Turkish girl coming from Istanbul, just for coming here, Washington, D.C. for 1 month intern. And I want to ask that how can you see the effort of the Turkish AKP government's effort to provide current issue in the international media? Today in Istanbul, the Arab Spring and Peace in the Middle East conference began in Istanbul, and a lot of leader, intellectual, professors go there. Can we reach any solution in this conference, or yeah?
So I'm sorry, your question is, generally, what can Turkish support do, and in particular, and the AKP government, and in particular, what can this particular conference do?
Yeah, I mean that Turkey, this conference is provide the make current issue in international society, because our leader is speaking about this issue, about this controversial issue too much, and the media is write these issues. So is it provide anything to
A solution to this?
yeah.
Yeah. I it actually is. I'm glad you raised the question, because it's remarkable that we've gone through most of this without raising the question of what the role of Turkey is in this. Yeah, please.
The Turkish has played a very, very big role the last 10 years in the region. And I think now they are not willing to be a part of the European Union, because they can see there's much more to get in the south than in the north. It's long time ago I heard Erdogan saying that we want to be member of the EU. So they are becoming a big player, a superpower in the region. And I think Turkey has played a big role to giving the Syrian economy a big boost. So Turkey are playing a big role, but I think Erdogan also listening to the public opinion. What I have heard is that in Turkey, even in Turkey, there's not a big support for intervening in Syria. It's still a minority of the Turkish people that want to intervene in Syria. That's what I've heard from people who knows the Turkey. And that's why it is long time ago we have heard Erdogan saying that we want to intervene. Now he's talking about secure zone and so on, but this need also military support. But the different Islamist government in the region, in Tunisia, Turkey, and so on, they are saying that their model is Turkey. They want to rule the countries like Turkey, and that's better than rule the countries like Saudi Arabia.
Please join me in thanking our panel, and I want to also thank them for being willing to stay over longer and answer so many extra questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. That's nice.
لا مشكلة